We'll try to get hold of our other guest speaker, and once she joins, we can start. Samir, I heard a rumor that you just launched another book. Is that true?
You mean the TVET study, or?
Yes.
Yeah, that was launched 2 days ago, yes.
So yes, hopefully you can share some of the key insights from that publication with us today. Very good. Good afternoon, everyone. So just to welcome you all here, and to welcome Emma, of course, making her fashionable late entrance. Oh, she decided to abandon us.
No, I'm here. Thank you.
Hi, Emma. Hi, Samir. Thank you all for joining, and thank you all for participating in our sport event today here. We have a very exciting topic that we are discussing today, and yeah, so I'm very happy to have Samir here and Emma. Samir, of course, is working in the SEHS, and Emma was the country economist in Indonesia, and now she's the country economist in Laos. So both of them, of course, have worked extensively on economic research with different issues, including SMEs. As we now know, SMEs have been one of the sectors that has been probably worst affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. But we think that even with this sort of a shock, there are opportunities for SME to thrive. So for our event today, what we are trying to do is take a slightly different approach than sort of what we normally do when we're looking at SME. It's like we trying to approach it that how can we sort of help create dynamic SMEs. So in the sense, the focus on today's discussion, or at least what we plan to hear from them today, is like, what are the things that we do, where we can do to help new SME to come up and thrive. I know that many of the existing work has been focused on trying to get, identifying problems with existing SME and how to get them to be better. What we have today is trying to say, in a sense, how do we help start up dynamic SME that we see in other countries, and hopefully we can also see in our countries in the region today. Maybe I'll start with Samir. Samir, what do you see are some of the key issues about, why we don't see as many, dynamic SMEs coming up in the region?
Sure, Bernard. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this seminar. I don't know if I would necessarily agree that they're not, there are not too many SMEs or MSMEs entering. I think that probably is not really true when we look at the data. But what is true is that the sort of the growth, once they enter the market, being able to grow and prosper, that's where the limitations normally lie. If you just look at the data, I think this is from the ERCD's report on MSMEs in Southeast Asia, actually, that just came out late last year. If you look at the number of MSMEs in terms of as a share of total enterprises, it's about 97.2%. Right, and so rightly so, a large share of enterprises are MSMEs, micro, small, and medium. In terms of employment, it's about 70%, 69.4%. So they are a huge creator of jobs. So without MSMEs, a lot of the countries will struggle to create jobs. And so again, they're very important in terms of job creation. as a contribution to GDP, again, hugely important, about 41% for the region, for Southeast Asia region. And as a export value, it's about 20%. So again, economically, it's enormously important, right, MSMEs. And so there's a lot of sort of entry that takes place. I mean, I haven't looked at the latest data on business dynamism for MSMEs in Southeast Asia, but one thing that I have looked at is where it shows that once they enter, their ability to grow and reach to new markets, access new customers tends to be difficult. And this is for a number of reasons. And I think I remember working in Indonesia, actually, we were as part of the same project a few years ago, where one of the key issues was on access to land, for example, right? So after a certain size, the regulation was a bit tougher on where you had to be located, how could you access land? And again, that's another challenge. That's one. When you look at small firms, even in agribusiness, similar stories that you see across our region is where when you grow in size, the requirements are a bit different even for agribusiness, right? So is it land pooling that's the solution? I'm not sure. It's been tried in different countries. So this is an important constraint facing a lot of countries. And I'm trying to avoid the access to finance. I know you told me already that let's not talk about access to finance. It always comes up. And I completely agree, actually. Access to finance is one of those things that we always mention. It's the easiest thing to talk about when we talk about small firms. So again, completely agree, but not being able to grow for a number of sort of a policy handicaps, maybe it's the right way to put it. Finance is one of them, but there are others that are very important. And one I want to point out in light of COVID-19, I'm sure we'll get into this in a few minutes, is that the access to ICT infrastructure, communication, right? That also is an important aspect, because when you look at the share of MSMEs in our region, what share of them are in different sectors, in services, so wholesale and retail trade, large share of MSMEs are there. Just to look at Philippines, for example, is 46.3% of MSMEs are in services, in wholesale and retail trade. The ones that have done well during COVID-19 are the ones that were in services that they could provide and reach to customers through digital technology. And the minute they could do that, they have been able to thrive during this time. But others less so, right? If you're a wholesale retail trade, if a guy by the side of the street, you're selling some bags or belts, it's very easy to reach to customers, right, through digital platforms. But if you're providing like food or delivering food, it's a very different story. Again, so here, it depends on, so during COVID, I think one constraint that has stood out, at least from my perspective, looking at the region, is that access to IT infrastructure, access to sort of digital access, right? The issue of digital divide has become even more sort of front and center, and that's something that's holding back some MSMEs while others have grown tremendously during this time. And I'll leave it at this. I think we'll talk more about this just to kind of start off the conversation. Over to you, Bernard. You're muted, I think, Bernard.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Sameh. I think you rightly pointed out that now access to digital is the new access to finance, right? So now every single paper will say, SME face this problem with the access to digital. Can you all hear me? I'm seeing some problem here.
Yeah, we can hear you, Bernard. We can hear you.
That's good. Yeah. So now let's take up from that point. I think what we do see in the pandemic is that there's been a big boom in the digital business, and of course in many other countries we see a lot of new company or startups taking advantage of this new digital how we say opportunities. We know that in Southeast Asia we do see some of these new digital startups coming up as well. So maybe I'll just ask Emma if you can share some experience about what are the sort of like the key areas that we see these new SMEs coming up, or have their rise been sort of prevented, or at least because of the existing large companies that are already in the digital space? Have they been able to take advantage, or have they been sort of how should we say, held back by the present or already the large company? Indonesia probably has a few examples of that, so maybe you'd like to share that, Emma?
Hey, Ben. So Thank you very much, Bernard, and thank you also for extending the invitation to me. It's a pleasure to get to think about some of these issues about how to support SME development. Again, I think the first thing that I just want to take a step back from your question, if you don't mind, and I think the first thing is to note is that it's important to try to understand the profile of micro, small and medium enterprises in Southeast Asia. And what we know is that the bulk of these enterprises operate in the informal economy. They have a profile of workers with low skill. And if they do try to invest in workers or capital, then they often have difficulty in retaining their workers that do have a higher level of skill, because that entails increasing wages and improving working conditions. So another point is that micro and small enterprises tend to have low employment costs per worker. And this is due to the large share of workers that are operating in unpaid positions, unpaid family workers, or workers that may be paid below the minimum wage. And this is, of course, associated with a large number of enterprises operating in the informal economy. So from the workers' side, if they're receiving low remuneration for their labour, then that may also have an implication for the amount that they can invest in their own skill development and support their own skill upgrading and subsequently enterprise upgrading as well. A third point is that the profit of informal enterprises tends to be small, which often limits investment in upgrading production mechanisms or provision of training to workers, which I already mentioned. So what this tells me is that the vibrancy of the micro and small enterprise community is perhaps not what we would see in more developed countries. A lot of these enterprises have subsistence and they have limitations. But one of the things that we do know, and the latest data point that I have is from 2018, sorry, and I would be really interested to see how this has changed with COVID. But in 2018, we had a baseline level of information reported in the labour force survey, which was the number of people that use internet in their job. So internet for productive purposes is what we broadly talked about it when we were creating the CPS for Indonesia, and it's 1 in 5 employed people. It could be an own account worker, an employee, or some type of other worker classification. So that's 1 in 5, or about 20% of people used internet on their job. And we put this in comparison to the statistic for the rest of the population. And what the statistic for the rest of the general population is that about 50% of Indonesians report to use the internet. And if you look a little bit deeper into the statistic, what you can see is that the Indonesians were using the internet for social media or for reading the news. So the interpretation is that usage of the internet and digital technologies hadn't penetrated the labour market and people's jobs as much as we would have assumed or liked to have seen. So pre-COVID, there was definitely a lot of space for integration of digital technologies in business strategies, and there were tools available pre-COVID, but there was limited take-up of those tools in businesses. And we know that there's a large digital tool literacy gap among the working population as well. Come COVID, we had work from home, learn from home, and there were a lot of changes that we all made. There was increased use of digital enabled transport services. But we know that much of the people that work in digital enabled transport services tend to be in disguised employment relationships and may not have the protections that we would like them to have access to. I think one of the other things that I'd note is that if we look at the successful companies globally, then what we can see is that companies like Netflix had growth because they were offering services that aligned with the behaviour changes that were induced from COVID suppression policies. And we saw that other companies like SeaWorld tanked in their stock price. And then we also saw companies that work in travel, which is largely digitally enabled nowadays. There's Traveloka and a whole bunch of like really cool places for buying travel tickets, but these companies have of course had issues. So therefore, one of the benefits of digital integration is very much related to the demand for the services offered by the companies. And there's been some take up, but what we know is that there was much more space for take up, and we have yet to have a proper assessment, I think, based on real data that's been collected by Bureau of Statistics globally. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma. So now maybe I see that we have one question, and I forgot to mention at the beginning earlier that we welcome questions and participation from our audience. So feel free to post your question in the chat box, or if you want to ask a question directly, feel free to raise your hand. So I think we have an interesting question from David here, which is like, you all can read it, but basically David was asking, does it even make sense to talk about SME, or should we just, move on and with a much more granular approach? So basically, maybe say let's focus on startups or focus on medium enterprises. Basically, David's saying that there's so much heterogeneity, so much variety in the type of SME that it may not make sense to sort of talk about them as one group, and the policy recommendation may also not be sort of something that's applicable to the whole group, but maybe more targeted policy. Any thoughts about that, Sameh? And maybe Sameh first, and then maybe we can ask Emma to also chime in later.
Sure, thank you, Bernard. That's actually the point I was going to talk about next, so I'm glad David brought this up. So basically, this is very, very important point. So the thing is, when we talk about MSMEs, completely could not agree more that we are lumping almost the whole world of enterprises in a developing country context, right? So David, to your point, I think it is important to talk about MSMEs or this world of enterprises in a more granular detail. That's only when you can come up with the right set of policy interventions to help them grow and reach new markets. I think here, even if you just look at the difference between developed world and developing world. So when you look at the OECD, OECD comes out with this really nice studies on MSMEs. And I think the minute you start looking at those, you will always see the difference between when you talk about MSMEs in a German or a US context, it's very different than when we talk about this in a developing country context. And why is that? I know that's a one question that, that I had asked myself, why is that? Why is the case that we see such different sort of impact of MSMEs? And when we talk about policy interventions, is that the definition is different. This is amazing because actually, when you look at the definition of what is a micro firm, what is a small firm, what is a medium firm, I mean, you go from Germany and the US, you're looking at a medium firm up to the size of 500 employees if you use employee as a benchmark for the measure, right? But when you come to places like Indonesia, when you look at the micro and small firm survey, there we're looking at 100 employees as a definition, a cutoff for the medium firm. So from 50 to 100, so 20 to 100 even. I think 5 to 20 is small, and then less than 5 is micro in case of Indonesia. But then you go to places like Germany and the US, the numbers are much larger. And again, so there comes a bit of a confusion when we talk about small and medium-sized enterprises as well. So it's important to sort of take that into account. And again, when we define, how do we define the MSMEs, right? So there are different ways of defining it. One is employee, which is the standard that's used globally. But even there's a bit of a disagreement. There have been some attempt at standardizing this, but again, there's differences depending on which country you're looking at. Asset is another way of looking at how you define medium and small enterprises, turnover, capital, and also you look at different sectors. So again, so different ways that we can define MSMEs, and it's very important to differentiate. I completely agree that when we're talking about developing country context, where 98% of all firms are in this category, then does it even make sense to talk about them as a group? And the short answer is it does not. It does not make sense, and especially when you look at, say, for example, the breakdown by sector, right? And Emma rightly pointed out, a lot of them are in wholesale and retail trade. So if you look at even that wholesale retail trade, and if you look at the firm size distribution within that sector, you see that most of the firms in wholesale retail trade are actually micro or small, because it is the nature of that work, right? It's slightly over the poverty line. It's informal employment. It's not something that has a lot of scope for raising labor productivity. So it's at that sort of in that group of that type of work, right? So a lot of the wholesale retail trade is there. And then now you go into, say, for example, manufacturing, construction. So there are medium-sized firms who are involved in manufacturing. There are medium-sized firms that are involved in construction. So again, there you see a completely different story, right? So if you go to construction, manufacturing, then you see the sort of slightly bigger firms in that space. And why is that? It also makes sense because there's scope for raising labor productivity. There's scope for getting new technology. So basically, you can be more efficient by using new ways of doing things in that group of firms. So it's very important to look at these separately when we talk about policy interventions. And I think we did some of this for the Indonesia work that Emma also was part of. So again, there we also looked at, depending on the size of the firms, depending on the sector, the interventions might be different. So it's important to keep that in mind. And I couldn't agree more, David, that we have to look at this group separately. We have to look at it separately. We have to look at it by sector to really come up with solutions in terms of helping them grow, policy interventions that will help them grow and prosper. To come up with the right set of interventions is much better to look at sort of granular details. I'll leave it at that, Bernard. I hope I answered David's question.
Thank you so much, Sameh. I'm sure you and David can have a long chat about this. But let's hear from Emma. Any thoughts on the issue, Emma?
Thanks, Bernard. I think, David, this is one of my first times of thinking about this particular issue, but I think that like Samir and yourself raised a very good point, that it might be time to, given that the digital concept has added a new realm to our understanding of the world, then it's probably right that we should get away from the traditional categorizations that we're thinking of and move towards something that's a little bit more nuanced and dynamic in line with the innovations that digital technologies are giving us. I'll stop here, thank you.
I just wanted to follow up on that. The next thing we're talking about, okay, we need to have a sort of a differentiated approach to SMEs. We know that the how should we say, the constraints they face are quite different from the small one to the medium one and so on. So let's move on to the part where maybe do we have any ideas about great policies that we can implement to help these SMEs, either to encourage more of them to start up or to encourage them to grow? Maybe Sameh can provide something on that.
Sure, Bernard. So, the thing is, I think in terms of there's a dog barking, I'm sorry. Anyway, so in terms of the policies that work, again, I think here it sort of follows up nicely from what David was asking in terms of definition. We need to be careful when we talk about policy interventions to support MSMEs. Because one biggest hindrance that we see actually is that their inability to grow, right? So yes, they can enter and capture a small share of the market, but then they can't somehow figure out how to grow. Of course, finance is one aspect of it, and being able to access finance, that's an important constraint for a lot of the small firms. But then there are other constraints that are in place, right? So for example, one area where there might be constraints is in terms of accessing new markets, like getting a license or getting some kind of a government permits. So these are, it's always been there. And I know in many of our PBLs that we work in, especially now the new one in Indonesia, we are trying to sort of, make it easier for firms to not just enter, but also to grow so that's an important way of doing it, by taking out, right set of policy interventions, right set of regulation. And that helps pretty much most firms, most small firms. But here, I think if we want to have the biggest bang for the buck, I think it will be important to understand the constraints facing specific sectors. And this is something that we tried to shed light on in the Indonesia manufacturing sector report, is that depending on the sector you look at, let's just focus on manufacturing sector. Even in the manufacturing sector, let's look at the medium-sized firms who are kind of linked to the global value chain, but could be better linked. What is stopping them, right? So is it because they can't access special economic zones, because they can't access a storage facility before they can export abroad? What is the one thing that's holding them back? And so that's the way you can really try to disentangle what is the right intervention that could be put in place. And I think, Bernard, it's very difficult to give policy solutions that sort of cross-cutting, because then it kind of assumes a one-size-fits-all. But I think what is important to do is first to really understand the constraints. And this is something that it's not done as much as we would like, actually. Even when you use, World Bank enterprise surveys or any kind of other surveys, we're always looking at it from sort of a bird's eye view, right? So I think it's very important to dig deeper into the firms and maybe even do some surveys of the firms in that particular sector to really understand before we design the right set of policies. And I think for the small firms that are trying to link up to the global value chain somehow to benefit from trade, the constraints might be very different than your regular wholesale and retail trade that operates domestically, right? So the one that operates domestically, we are talking about in this, for example, in light of COVID and unequal access to digital technology. Here, some of those small firms might benefit better if they had better access to digital technology. And one last piece of evidence from this ERCD report is that most of the MSMEs that operate in our countries in Southeast Asia, they are all outside of the capital region. So in the Philippines, I was checking the data, it's almost 80% they're outside of NCR. Similarly, in Thailand, they're outside of the capital city. So they all operate outside of the capital city. What does that mean? What that basically means that we ought to make sure that they have access to the right set of infrastructure, ICT infrastructure, to operate in this market where access to digital technology is critical. So maybe that's one area that will benefit most of these firms. I'll leave it at this, Bernard. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sameh. So I think that's an important point. I mean, heterogeneous group of SMEs requires differentiated policy responses. So again, probably as we go ahead, we probably want to take a much more sectoral approach, looking at because I think may not be that useful to think about challenges or policy implication for SME as a group as a whole, but more rather to look at sector by sector, what are the challenges in the sectors, and I think that's an important lessons I think we can all take. Maybe I'll follow that up with Emma. Emma, of course, has been interested in using how we say more new research data sources. I know she's very interested in the work of Nicholas Boom in using to try to identify constraints for SMEs. Maybe you can help us to think more about the sort of this sector approach to SME. How can we sort of what are the kind of research we need to do to identify the sort of the best way to help these SMEs? How about that, Emma?
So one of the cool things that we've seen come out of data has been utilization of different sources of administrative data. It's not traditional by any means, we wouldn't put it in the traditional category. Nevertheless, these data sources have been available to government, but they've been underutilized. And one of the, for Indonesia, one of the data sources that they tapped into was from the state-owned pawnbroker company, which has access to a lot of information on or it has interactions with a lot of micro and small enterprises. So it can potentially provide access to ultra micro recipients that are seeking their services and try to offer them different types of financial services rather than just asset disposal. For example, extension of access to finance with the banking system. So I think that that's one thing that's been really interesting. I know that Indonesia's also tapped into utilization of the commercial bank data as well, the telecom data for identifying beneficiaries of state support to support COVID recovery. And there's a few other sources as well. So I would encourage policymakers to look more into the different sources of administrative data that they have and try to think about how that could enhance access to different pockets of the population that may be needing support from COVID. But I think the other thing that I wanted to highlight in response to this question was, the question was specifically any ideas about government policies that can support development of new SMEs. So when I thought about this question, I also thought about Indonesia's COVID response policy. And they had provision of little packages for supporting internet quota to enable work from home, learn from home. It was particularly for students and teachers. And what the finding about the second quarterly report for the Indonesia Cares program was that there was an idea that the internet subsidies provided to students and teachers may have been squandered in areas with little or no connectivity. And I found this to be really shocking, but of course it's true, because there's about 12,500 villages throughout the country, and only 75,000 of them 75,000 of them have yet to connect to 4G mobile services. So the internet itself may be patchy in these areas, which is a limitation. And I would see the role of the state to be extension of services and support for serving the underserved. That's something that ADB does. Here I would emphasize Samir's final point that he mentioned, which was improving infrastructure for internet connectivity and logistics support, especially for frontier and outermost least developed regions throughout the country. I think that could be a very, very useful support from the government for promoting equity and ensuring that at least the basic infrastructure is there to enable communities, including businesses, people, students, workers, to take advantage of the new technologies that are coming.
Thank you so much, Emma. We have a question from Duse here. Sameh, any sort of findings from your study about the role of subnational government? I suppose this means local government in sort of supporting informal and micro SMEs. I'm a bit not sure. Duse, maybe you can tell us what you mean by capturing informal. You mean supporting or?
Thank you, Bernard. Yeah, I'm just wondering, how the other countries succeed in terms of putting them in the formal or making them part of the formal system. Um, by doing so, they can get the necessary support. So I'm just wondering if there is a model that we can, look into. Thank you.
Thanks, Dulce. Samir?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great point, Dulce. So actually, that reminds me of a. So there's an effort going on in several countries. I'm not sure about the Philippines, but because of the prevalence of the informal sector, so what countries are doing is sort of leveraging the fact that many of the small firms, they use digital payment systems to actually somehow try to formalize them, bring them into the sort of the formal sector. And this is something that is happening in several countries actually, and the ILO is involved in doing sort of helping this process of formalization as well in developing Asia. And this is one way of sort of getting them to be part of the formal sector, but not just to formalize them, but also because that comes with other benefits as well, right? Especially in the medium to long term, where it will not only raise their maybe access to some of the government benefits, some of the government programs that are in place, and that's something it will help them. So it's basically leveraging firms' use of digital technology to actually organically formalize them. And that's something that is taking place. And I think we could do more of that, where even the registration process for a firm could be sort of digitized completely, where it can be done from a mobile platform. Then it's much easier to link up firms into the broader sort of tax system, right? So that's one that is taking place. And the other thing I kind of wanted to point out, I know it might be a bit, controversial. I might get in trouble for saying this, but since we provide so much support for SMEs, is that it goes back to the point that David raised, right? Because it's not a one monolith, sort of, it's not a one group that we can talk about as like this group, let's do things to support this group, right? So what I wanted to say is that if you compare large firms and small firms in developing country context across them, I'm generalizing a bit, but when you look at Indonesia, Philippines, India, when you look at the difference between large firms and small firms, you see that in terms of wages, large firms pay better wages than small firms do. Right? And large firms tend to be more export oriented than small firms. Large firms tend to actually be more innovative, surprisingly enough, which is counterintuitive because the reason why it's counterintuitive is that when we think of small, medium firms being innovative, we think of the advanced world. We don't think of Philippines. We are thinking of, the digital so the revolution that is taking place, some of these companies that started very small, right? That's what we think of. But actually, as it turns out, in this part of the world, that's not quite the case. It's the large players that are the most important for the country. And in terms of value added in the sector, when you look at the manufacturing sector, most of the value added does come from large firms. So I think it's very important for us to support firms to grow if we want them to achieve scale and if we want them to make a contribution. So it's like a country cannot get richer by just relying on micro and small firms. We have to actually create large firms or help small firms grow into a large firm, and any efforts at that tends to pay off, and we have seen this across the region. Over to you, Bernard.
Thank you so much, Samir. Yeah, so that's I think that's a great point that you say there. I just want to go back to David's question because he has many questions about formalization. I think you mentioned part of that where you say digital technology can probably help make sort of registration and everything easier, and also to a certain extent, I guess the big digital company are sort of becoming like a de facto, how should we say, registrant, right? So I mean, like companies, informal company that were probably not registered with the government, probably may be registered with Shopee or Lazada because they need that to create their sort of online profile and all that. So, but David was saying that okay, should we just how should we say, fly by the seat of our pants, or should we do a detailed diagnostic? So I know that Emma is probably thinking about all these new empirical study. Is there anything that you think we can do, or is there some particular way you think that will be useful to study? What's the best way to sort of move firms from informality to formality? Emma?
Yeah, I think that this has been an ongoing problem. And if we have an ongoing problem, then it probably means that there's multiple constraints to firm formalization, and that requires a very complex policy response. So I think it's not just about improving businesses and creating business licensing, and creating linkages between Shopee and the government system. One of the issues that Gojek brought up with us is that they were not rushing ahead with their cooperation with the DG Tax because they felt that there might be a risk to their members going to another platform if they were to introduce tax compliance and the transparent sharing of information that they have on their members with the tax office. And I think that this is a broader issue than just the issue with like Gojek and their members and DG Tax. From my understanding, one of the issues with informal enterprises is that they tend to underreport their sales and their income. So even, the Bureau of Statistics goes and does surveys, and maybe they do assessments for banks and things like this as well, and there's documents that they submit. But, even in Australia it happens, we'll just take a cash payment for this one and won't put it on the books. The more you're made to be transparent, that could be a hindrance to the formality. So how do you overcome this particular issue? I think that it's a kind of another one of these broad strategies about improving the overall quality of institutions and ensuring that you have good governance structures where you decrease corruption amongst the public civil servants. So informal payments from enterprises to local officials that allow them to operate, so that then it's more justified for the public to insist to have responsible enterprises that pay taxes, and that become a normal expectation. That's a big issue for me, and I think that would probably go a long way to supporting improved tax compliance in society more generally.
Okay. Thank you very much, Emma. And I know that An Husa, who's from our digital technology group, wants to say something. Maybe he has a silver bullet, magic bullet.
Of course I do. No, thanks for having this discussion. I think it's super interesting. And I just wanted to come in with some ideas because earlier we touched on policy responses and ideas on how could you react. And since the topic is dynamic SMEs, we tend to veer towards digital, which of course is not all that dynamic SMEs can be. But on digital, I thought there are two responses that are quite useful, which have been deployed. And one is the fact that SMEs often service each other or service larger companies with services in the digital space. And they struggle really to get contracts when they haven't really proven their technologies. So one of the policy responses that Singapore has taken is to accredit through an accreditation program solutions that the government can greenline through the procurement system and actually purchase directly from these small companies. And what that does is, of course, it builds reference points, it builds a portfolio of success stories if they are successful working with government. and that then builds out a cohort of modern dynamic SMEs. I thought that was a very interesting idea. It depends a little bit on the ability of the government institutions in our DMCs to really handle that type of process, but I think they could get help from private sector in the accreditation process. The other thing I wanted to mention is relating to infrastructure, and this has been mentioned about the importance of digital connectivity. But one of the kind of lubricants in the digital economy is cloud computing. And cloud computing simply cannot work without digital connectivity. So it's a little bit like layers. First, you've got to have electricity, then you've got to have digital connectivity. And then the next one in my mind is really cloud, because cloud enables even the tiniest small company to buy a service from a cloud computing company at a very small fee, a per use thing. And then actually when they have traction, when they've tested their product through this fairly reasonably priced ability to manage data calculation, all kinds of task loads, they can then scale very quickly. And so that flexibility is hugely important to startups and new businesses working in the digital space. So to me, encouraging cloud computing and giving the right policy framework for that to happen is a key factor in enabling a digital economy. And my unit is currently working on 2 papers. One is actually cloud for government and one is cloud for startups. So I'm very happy to know this discussion because I think it ties very well into each other. What benefits do startups get from cloud, but what does government have to do to actually foster cloud computing as a key component in the ecosystem? So I guess my question would be, do you think that our DMCs could actually get into these kinds of policy responses more, working around it, promoting cloud or working through an accreditation through their government procurement? Is that something where you think our governments are ready in Southeast Asia to go for something like that?
Thank you, Anne. I assume that question is not, directed directly to our 2 panelists, but to the group here in general who represents the collective wisdom of all the people in Southeast Asia. But maybe David, because David has been working quite closely with the Cambodia government on a big data initiative there. Do you want to say something, David? David Friedman, I'm referring to you, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Bernard. Good afternoon, everyone. Now, you give me a taste of my own medicine, put me on the spot. But yeah, I actually don't have so much to say. I mean, I think what Arndt said is exactly correct, in terms of connectivity, the basic enabling infrastructure. What's interesting in Cambodia's case is they're quite big businesses which are informal, and they actually benefit from informality. It's a deliberate strategy. They're not paying taxes. Perhaps more importantly, they're avoiding all of the unofficial payments, or many of the unofficial payments that come when they transact with government, and they just remain below the radar. They stay never big enough to catch anyone's attention, nice and profitable. And yeah, we're not talking about access to finance, but they can access finance, if they need to. They may not have a formal bank account and loan and everything else, but they can get money if they need to. So that's a kind of challenge for the government in terms of revenue mobilization and also the enabling that transformation or the productivity improvement. And I sort of implicit in my question, so the government is taking a bit of a mixture of the different strategies. The stick is there. They're trying to enforce and crack down on firms that are big and informal and outside the sort of net. But then they're also doing things to try and make the whole system more efficient. And digital technology, ICT and e-government is a key part of that. So the sort of the CamDX is modeled on Estonia's national data exchange. And it's a very, I think, interesting technology platform. If I can, I'll post a little presentation the government gave on this a while back. It's really impressive. When I saw it, I was quite blown away. I was like, wow, this is not what I expected. Very forward thinking. And the whole, I guess, approach is to create the architecture to enable data exchange through government, and then to build a whole series of services and different applications on the back of that. So they started with business registration and licensing and moving into other areas. At the same time, there's definitely an effort to create a whole startup culture, digital ecosystem, and everything else. And I think there actually we should be realistic about the skills base that you need. So for economies, for businesses to be users and consumers of technology platforms and services is relatively straightforward. They're designed to be user friendly, so it's easy to open your retailer's account on Shopify or whatever. To actually be developing and generating new innovation and technology, they need significantly more skills and human capital. So I think probably the biggest thing we should be looking at is the skills base within the economy, and that can be STEM disciplines, and then also the more applied sort of training, whether it's on software development, computer programming, all of those things. And that's, I think, if you create that critical mass of people that have the requisite skills, generally there's a supportive ecosystem and approach. Government's keen to see it happen. There will be, that entrepreneurial energy will come up, and you'll start to see these more dynamic SMEs. But I think going back to my first point, we should be, if we're interested to see startups or manufacturing SMEs that are connected into global value chains, we should really zoom in on those particular segments, which we think can have an important contribution to the overall economic transformation, rather than talking about SMEs in a very diffuse and general way, because they basically will move along with the economy as a whole. And as better tools and technologies become available, they will use them and they'll take them up. But in terms of the dynamism and driving the whole change, it's not so likely. And I think Hoven's point in the chat box kind of spoke to that, is that in the past, it's probably been a misdirected public policy and a lot of effort, which reflects, I guess, maybe it could be politically popular, but in terms of generating results, in terms of economic productivity and that transformation, may be less useful. Anyway, I've said enough. I'll stop now. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you very much for answering Hoven's question. I was scratching my head on how to answer that, but thankfully you managed to save my skin and answer that question. So thank you so much, David. Good points all. And a good thing that you raised the issue about skills, because we've been hearing from our skilled Sifu here, Sameh, because he has recently released a publication about how to improve skills using TVET, at least the new digital skills that are required. Why don't you share some of our findings and maybe some of the key things that we think we can do based on your recent study, Sameh?
Sure. Thank you, Bernard. So on this, thank you to David for bringing up the skills issue, because actually this is critical, because one of the things that for this, we have another TA on education technology, and when we're looking into the adult digital skills, we find that when teachers were told classroom has moved online, virtual, everybody was caught off guard, but nobody thought of the teachers, because if you're a geography teacher, maybe you're not so used to using virtual platforms, or maybe you are, and it depends on the country, of course, but. So goes to show that the average digital skills, adult skills, is very, very low, actually. So we couldn't just assume that, that everybody would be able to move completely online. And one of the things we saw, especially in Indonesia, talking to the Ministry of Education and Culture there, is that teachers were afraid to use Mac or PCs, but they were happy with phones. So anything that moved on to a smartphone, much easier to manage. But if you go to computer, no, that's not easy to manage. And I know we are working with Arndt and the team on sort of ed tech space. So again, that's points he raised, all very, very valid. On the TVET studies, a couple of things that stood out on the TVET study is that enterprise-based training is the most effective. So what is an enterprise-based training? Enterprise-based training is basically you're pretty much linked to a special economic zone, or you're linked to a big firm that's looking for a steady supply of skilled workers. And if that's the case, then it tends to lead to good employment outcomes. But if it's not the case, then it doesn't lead to a good employment outcome. So we saw sort of under-skilling. The perfect matching is relatively low in the TVET space. So again, in case of the Philippines, of course, 10% is publicly provided TVET, 90% is private. But what the publicly provided TVET does, which is a great thing, is that it caters to very low-income households. So very low-income households who can actually benefit from publicly provided training. So again, so there's a lot there, but I would say we need to rethink the role of publicly provided training in the age of Industry 4.0, in the age of rapidly changing demand for labor. So we really need to rethink that, and that was sort of the main conclusion from that study. Over to you, Bernard.
Thank you so much, Samir. We are coming to an end. So I'll just ask Emma if you want to say something.
Yeah,
on a poll, forced to give an opinion. So maybe she wants to give the context of why she's forcing us to give our view.
Yeah, exactly. I was a little bit stirred up, and I was trying to think, to Ardent's comment about use of cloud computing, and first now we've got computers, and then we've got the internet, and now we've got cloud computing, and there's all of these options available to us if only to use SharePoint. And of course, we all have been forced to use Microsoft Teams. To say that I was a key instigator of this, and of course SharePoint now, and COVID has forced this change on us, and I think that we can all appreciate it. But I know that ADBs are and the people who work for ADB are and in Laos, for example, government officials are a long way away from having a functional SharePoint system with systematic filing and sharing of files and joint collaborative work with. They still, on the ADB fact sheet, they have Gmail addresses for the Director General Debt Relations at the Ministry of Finance. A long way away from. And I remember Samir and I, once we went down, which is Indonesia's Ministry of Planning, under the hood of their staff management system, and it was terrifying, the inefficiencies that the officials, systems that the officials are forced to use, which are time-consuming and not enabling colleagues to have a kind of friendly and interaction with technology, but rather it draining their productivity and them seeing limited benefits in having these systems in place. So I think that there's a lot of work to do in that space, and I can see from the poll that we've split between 30% of officials in our developing member countries not having official Gmail email addresses, and 70% said yes. So it's a real mixed situation, and I think that there's a long way to go with government policy and government officials to enable them to create, to help to create and enable better use of technologies throughout the population. I'll stop.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think we come towards the end of our sport event today. It was, David wants to say something, so I'll let him say something, and then we'll close the event. David.
Thank you, Bernard. Is it true that it's your last day today?
No, it's not true. I still have at least 30 years left according to the standard life expectancy chart. I want
there's no life outside SERD. What are you talking about?
Get your ADP pension. I'm going to live long enough to deplete it. Yes, it's not my last day. It's also not my last day in SERC either. My first day in the new job is on the 5th of April.
Okay. Will there be any more spots before you finish or before you move?
The last spot.
Okay.
No, the spot is not me. The spot is you all, right? I may disappear, but you all will ensure the spot will live on, because you all make the spot such a special event. And this bringing of minds together, the free exchange of ideas, like we see today, right? I mean, somebody from the RM, somebody from the sector division, somebody from the from the thematic group, all sort of coming in together and sharing the idea. This is like the whole spirit of one ADB and the whole spirit of scholarship and research, right? Yeah. So don't worry, sport will continue. The job is open. We'll have an American Idol or Sport Idol competition to decide who can do it next.
All right. Thank you, Bernard. Thanks for organizing it. It's been really good. Yeah.
Thank you, Bernard.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's been great today. I mean, I learned so much, and I think it's great. I mean, like one summary I can say is that, forget about SME policy. Like, let's have a sector policy that is targeted, and this is where we're going to get the best result. And we really need help to get the country on track to digitalization, right? Because that's a key determinant of it's like a general purpose technology we need for the success in the future. So, okay, I think thank you so much. It's been great. It's been great discussion. Thank you so much, Samir and Emma, taking the time of their schedule to join us and share their thoughts. And of course, thank you all the participants who have been, listening in and also coming up with great questions and commenting as usual. So looking forward to our next event. The sport will continue. Don't worry. DUSE will not let it die. And of course, thank you so much to the team behind the sport as usual, DUSE, Sheila, and Hannah. So let's give them all a big hand. Let's give all of us a big hand.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dulcie, Sheila, and Hannah.
Thank you.
And Bernard.